In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. The line is so old, so familiar, that few stop to ask the question hidden within it. What if even that darkness is only a dream? What if the endless war, the gods, and the galaxy itself are nothing more than the fevered thought of something far greater, something that dreams reality into being? Before we begin, a brief note to the viewer. If you enjoy deep explorations of Warhammer's cosmology and the outer reaches of its myth, consider subscribing and leaving your thoughts below. Every question shapes which forgotten truths we uncover next. Now let us step into the void. For 41 millennia, humanity has survived, balanced on the edge of two oceans of reality. The first is the Imperium, the physical universe of stars, planets, flesh, and metal. The second is the immaterium, or warpa, psychic ocean that underlies existence. It is not empty space, but a roiling sea of emotion, memory, and thought. Every dream, every fear, every act of love or violence leaves a ripple in that sea. Over the ages, those ripples became waves, and those waves became storms that took form as gods. Korn, lord of rage and bloodshed; Dzench, architect of fate; Nurgle, father of decay; Slanesh, prince of excess. They are not deities in the true sense, but reflections, echoes of the minds that created them. When mortals feel, the warp feeds. When they suffer, it grows strong. The chaos gods are the mirror of sentient life, shaped by it and shaping it in return. For millennia, imperial scholars and the Ordo Malleus believed this duality matter, and thought flesh and warp to be the ultimate truth, two sides of a single coin. But what if there is something beyond even the warp? Among the forbidden texts of the Black Library and ancient Necron inscriptions lies evidence of a deeper layer, a horizon outside all psychic perception, a realm that predates thought itself. The first trace of this idea comes from a pre-imperial record known as the Narcotic Fragment, believed to be a human translation of Xenos' origin. It speaks of the blind god at the center of all, whose dreaming birthed the spheres. The Eldar knew of a being called Athoth, though human phonetics render the name differently. Asathoth, thrashing sultan, the demon sleeping king, to the Mechanicus. Early warp analysts logged it merely as an anomaly, a resonance that the warp refracted but did not produce. This was not a warp phenomenon, was something deeper, something beneath the psychic sea itself. During the early explorations of the halo stars in M35, multiple navigator houses reported hearing drumbeats beneath the warp currents. They claimed their third eye's mutations that perceive the immaterium sensed rhythm rather than light, a slow and cyclic pulse echoing through the void. Imperial ships dispatched to trace this pulse vanished. Those that returned brought back navigators whose third eyes had fused shut, calcified as though petrified by what they had seen. Their logs all repeated the same image in different words, a vast, blind eye surrounded by twisting geometries that could not be drawn the same way twice. Across the galaxy, similar accounts appeared among the Eldar Farseers. Their runes shattered mid-casting, their prophecies fell into disarray, and the webway itself began to twist unpredictably in remote sectors. The Eldar called this event when the loom phrase from the weaver's sleep. They believed the universe was a tapestry held together by consciousness. Thought the dreamer behind it stirred. The threads would loosen. By the dawn of the 41st millennium, humanity's psychic dependence on the Emperor's Astronomicon made it uniquely sensitive to warp disturbance. What began as faint irregularities in astropathic signals soon became impossible pattern static that hummed like music, fragments of rhythm embedded within psychic noise. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica dismissed it as warp interference. But deep in the vaults of Terra, the Ordo Malleus and the Ordo Chronos began to cross-reference the pulse frequency with forgotten stellar anomalies. The result was chilling. The pulse seemed to emanate from no fixed point in space or time. It came from everywhere, resonating through the warp and the materium alike, as though the universe itself were vibrating in its sleep. In secret conclaves, inquisitors debated what this meant. Some claimed it was the approach of a new chaos god. Others feared it was the death throes of the warp itself. But a few, those who had read the ancient Xenos texts and connected the patterns, whispered a far darker interpretation that the warp, the gods, and all reality were not self-contained at all. They were the dream of an infinite mind, and that mind was beginning to stir. If the warp is the echo of consciousness, then what happens when consciousness itself wakes up? That question would drive heretics, inquisitors, and even the Mechanicus to madness. For the first time, the Imperium faced the possibility that chaos was not the top of the cosmic hierarchy, but merely the noise made by something greater turning in its sleep. Something the Eldar once called the sleeper at the center. Something humanity would come to know by a single forbidden name, whispered only in silence. In the final centuries of M41, as the Imperium strained beneath endless war, a quieter but far more insidious threat began to surface, one buried deep within the data streams of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides Imperial ships through the warp, began to flicker not in brightness, but in pattern. Its pulse, normally steady, began to resonate with faint irregularities. To most, it was meaningless noise, mere interference caused by warp storms or solar flux. But to a few within the Ordo Malleus and the Ordo Chronos, the pattern was unmistakably deliberate. The anomaly first appeared as a subtle harmonica, rhythmic oscillation, repeating every 71 hours across thousands of light-years. At first, only isolated sectors recorded it. The Ultima Segmentum, the northern reaches of Segmentum Solar, and a few scattered points near the galactic rim. When the data was overlaid, the points did not form a map of space. Instead, they created a temporal pattern, ripple through time itself. The Ordo Chronos, the Inquisition's time theory division, became involved almost immediately. Their archives contained only one other recorded event of similar structure: the K10 singularity signal, first noted during the rediscovery of a Necron tomb world in M38. The correlation was heretical even to suggest, but the logic was inescapable. Both signals displayed geometric harmonics that aligned not with warp resonance, but with the mathematical constants underlying reality, the fundamental vibration of the materium. In essence, something was shaking the lattice of existence itself. The Mechanicus called it the null tone. The Inquisition gave it a different name, the dreambeat. The discovery of the dreambeat threw the Inquisition into civil war. Radical factions, like the Xanthites, believed it to be a natural byproduct of humanity's growing psychic evolution, proof that the species was on the brink of transcending even the warp. Puritan elements within the Ordo Malleus argued it was a sign of a new chaos entity, forming perhaps an aspect of the Emperor himself, or the shadow of his long-dead twin. But one scholar, a Magos of the Ordo Chronos, named Thassalon Vane, proposed a far more disturbing possibility. Vane suggested that the warp and materium were not dual realms, but sublayers of a single greater medium. He argued that both were part of a higher dimensional field, a kind of dream membrane, and that the rhythmic pulses observed across the Astronomicon were not disturbances within the dream, but tremors caused by the dreamer. In his own words, if the immaterium is a sea of thought, then perhaps it is not ours. Perhaps we are only bubbles within it, and the tide does not belong to us. Vane's research drew upon forbidden Xenos material, the Necron dolmen codices, fragments of pre-Old One mathematics, and even shards of Eldar wraithbone that carried psychic scars from before the fall. When he cross-referenced them, the results produced a terrifying image, a spiral pattern that, when mapped against galactic coordinates, formed not a constellation, but a vortex centered nowhere in infinite inward fall. The spiral's ratios matched the sound frequency of the dream beat perfectly. The Inquisition sealed Vane's work within the vaults of Saturn, declaring it techno-heresy of the highest order. But rumors persisted that copies of his findings survived encoded into machine spirits, traded through encrypted astropathic bursts, and even whispered among the navigators who had once seen the blind geometry with their third eyes. Some began to call themselves the dream-bound, believing that through the pulse they could hear the song of the blind god, the true creator of the warp. They claimed that chaos was not divine, but parasitic, feeding on fragments of the original dream that seeped through the cracks of consciousness. Meanwhile, Imperial astrocartographers discovered something even more unsettling. Across the galactic map, warp routes began to curve subtly toward empty space, as if drawn by unseen gravity. Ships that entered those regions experienced time distortion, reports of reversed causality, and visions of spinning mandalas that resembled clockwork that melted as it turned. One ship, the Oath of Perpetua, emerged from warp translation 8,000 years in the past, its crew babbling in tongues unknown to any linguistic archive. Before they could be quarantined, the crew self-immolated, chanting a single phrase recorded on Vox, "The Dreamer is stirring." By M41.909, the Astronomicon's irregularities could no longer be denied. Entire sectors began to lose contact not from warp storms or tyrannid invasion, but from silence. Astropaths described the absence not as emptiness, but as a swallowing. To hear it was to feel one's mind collapse inward, as though reality itself was being folded. When inquisitorial psychers were exposed to the dream beat under controlled conditions, every one of them described the same vision: a throne of writhing geometry, surrounded by shapes too vast to comprehend, all orbiting a blind, churning center that screamed without sound. The Eldar, too, sensed the change. Farseers abandoned their craft worlds, declaring that the warp had become hollow. The webway trembled with invisible pressure, and the Harlequin's keepers of cosmic balance spoke in riddles of the Sultan's awakening. Even the Necrons, who denied the existence of the warp altogether, began to stir. Deep beneath the galactic crust, their tomb worlds hummed to life. For the first time in millions of years, the Silent King's algorithms adjusted to account for a variable they had long considered impossible: the destabilization of physical constants themselves. And yet, the Imperium still did not understand the full scope of what was happening. The flickering Astronomicon, the vanishing fleets, the rhythmic pulse echoing across Timol were symptoms of a single phenomenon. The dream was shifting. The fabric of both realities was being rewritten, not by warp, sorcery, or demonic will, but by something that existed beyond both, something that had never known intention, purpose, or awareness, till now. To the Inquisition, it was a heresy that could not be spoken. To the Eldar, it was the returning of the first noise. To the Necrons, it was the reactivation of the original equation. But to those who listened too long, who let the dreambeat seep into their thoughts, it was a lullaby sung by the universe itself, lullaby that promised one terrible truth. Everything that exists is the dream of something sleeping, and it is beginning to wake. By late M41, the signs were no longer isolated or hidden in data logs. They were everywhere. Astropaths began to die by the thousands, their minds bursting into flames of psychic energy as they screamed of visions they could not comprehend. Imperial cults rose and fell overnight, each claiming to hear the same thing, a song coming from the void, a low, rhythmic hum that felt less like sound and more like the vibration of thought itself. The Adeptus Mechanicus, terrified by what they could not measure, declared the disturbances to be omnisciac noise, an act of divine communication through broken data. But among the most secret conclaves of the Ordo Malleus, there was no longer any doubt. Something vast and blind was stirring beneath the warp, and its awakening was beginning to reshape reality itself. The first undeniable manifestation occurred in the Cadian system, only weeks before the planet's final fall. In the last moments, before Abaddon's assault reached its peak, a warp storm, unlike any previously recorded, engulfed the Eye of Terror. But within that storm, something impossible appeared, a region of absolute stillness, where even chaos could not exist. Ships that drifted into it found their Geller fields unnecessary, their demons silent. Those who looked into that void described an absence of color and thought, as though their souls had been erased and replaced with an emotionless gaze. Imperial observers recorded the event as the Still Eye. To this day, no one knows what emerged from it. The Chaos Gods themselves seemed to falter. Khorne's domains in the warp began to fracture, his endless battlefield sinking into silence. His champions felt their rage dissolve into confusion, as if their purpose no longer existed. Nurgle's garden withered, its grotesque fertility replaced by stillness so profound that even decay ceased. Sinch's shifting labyrinth froze in mid-transformation, and Slaaneish's palace of sensation turned cold, its music falling silent. To the demons who remained aware, it felt as though their gods were being suffocated, not destroyed, but unmade. The warp, for all its madness, had always been alive, filled with will and emotion. Now it began to die, replaced by something vast and indifferent. Inquisitor Kestrel Varin of the Ordo Malleus, one of the last living scholars of Thassalon Vane's dreambeat theory, described the change as a cooling of thought. Her final report, transmitted moments before her death, read, "The warp is no longer reacting to us. It is reacting to something else, something that has begun to think. Across the galaxy, strange phenomena spread like infection. Worlds awoke to skies that pulsed like living tissue. Mountains twisted into spirals and then vanished. Time itself began to loop in brief, horrifying cycles. On one agri-world, crops grew overnight, withered, and regrew within seconds, repeating endlessly as if trapped in a fragment of the dream. In another sector, an entire fleet of the Imperial Navy appeared over a world they had never visited, their logs showing a date 10,000 years into the future. Every crew member had gone blind, and in their blindness they wept with joy, whispering, "We have seen the throne." The Eldar were the first to recognize what was happening. Their seers gathered in the remnants of Ulthwé and communed through the Infinity Circuit, seeking guidance from the spirits of their ancestors. But what they found was not wisdom, it was silence. The Soulstone Matrix, once vibrant with psychic light, went dark. When the Farseers tried to reach into it, they heard only a single phrase repeated endlessly: "The Weaver has turned in its sleep." For the Eldar, that could mean only one thing: the universe itself was changing hands. Even the Necrons, beings of pure logic and anti-psych, began to react. The KTN shards, those godlike entities that fed on stars, screamed within their prisons, their crystalline forms fracturing under unseen pressure, their energy signatures distorted into patterns identical to the dreambeat frequency. Whatever was awakening, it did not belong to the warp, nor to the material universe. It was pressing against both, collapsing the boundary between them. The Necron Silent King, Sharik, reactivated long-dormant command codes, issuing a single command across his empire: "Contain the dream." His scientists, once masters of physical law, found their equations unraveling as constants changed from one moment to the next. To them, it appeared that the mathematical foundation of the universe, light, gravity, entropy, was being rewritten in real time. Meanwhile, deep within the Soul System, the Emperor of Mankind, entombed upon the Golden Throne, began to stir. For 10,000 years, he had been silent, a corpse that glowed with godlike power. But now, his psychic field wavered. The Astronomican's pulse, once the heartbeat of humanity, began to synchronize with the dreambeat itself. Across Terra, Psychers screamed as one, crying out that the Master is seeing the dreamer. The High Lords of Terra ordered the throne, sealed, and all communication with the Emperor's chamber severed. But it was already too late. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor's consciousness reached beyond the warp. What he found was not chaos, not the Imperium, but a vast, swirling void of blind motion, an entity that had never known reason or intention. And within that void, he felt something look back. The Emperor's psychic essence, forged from the will of thousands of ancient souls, faltered in the presence of that gaze. He understood in an instant that even his divinity was a reflection, that his power, the warp, and all the gods that warred within it were merely flickers inside a greater dream. The blind throne was not his, it had never been. Across the warp, the chaos gods began to scream. Their realms disintegrated into waves of soundless chaos, their forms breaking apart into primal symbols. Khorne's roar turned to silence, Slaaneish's laughter became static, and Tyzanch's plans dissolved into infinite stillness. For the first time, the gods felt fear, not of death, but of meaninglessness. The realization spread like infection. They were not gods at all. They were figments, fragments of the dreamer's nightmare, and the nightmare was ending. And as the galaxies trembled, as the Astronomican flickered one final time, a shadow deeper than the warp passed through reality. It did not arrive. It did not move. It was the pulse of the dreambeat, slowed, then steadied, resonating through every atom of existence. All across the galaxy, from the lowest hive scum to the mightiest psyker, every being experienced a moment of absolute stillness, and for that single eternal instant they all saw the same thing. A throne not made of gold but of writhing geometry, a seat of blind chaos, where the Emperor and the warp and all of creation were nothing more than ripples in a vast, slumbering mind. The dreamer had opened one eye. The moment the dreamer opened its eye, the universe changed, not with a sound or explosion, but with a quiet folding of truth. Across the galaxy, the laws that once defined existence began to fail in strange, unpredictable ways. The warp, that endless sea of thought and emotion, started to lose coherence. Psychers could no longer reach beyond themselves. Sorcerers found their incantations dying halfway through, not because of resistance, but because the very medium that carried psychic energy was evaporating. The Imperium, the foundation upon which gods and demons had existed since the dawn of time, was ceasing to dream. At first, the changes were subtle. Warp travel became erratic, then impossible. Ships that entered the Imperium emerged light years off course, or not at all. Some reported the warp as empty, a vast space devoid of energy, its storms replaced by a static silence that stretched into infinity. Astropaths, once able to communicate across the stars, described the growing nothingness as suffocating, a void that pressed against their minds until they could no longer think. For the first time since the birth of the Imperium, the galaxy was going dark. In the great cathedrals of Terra, priests of the ecclesiarchy fell to their knees, crying out that the Emperor's light had gone dim. The Astronomicon still burned, but its flame flickered, irregular and cold. The High Lords of Terra, desperate for answers, summoned every remaining Inquisitor and Magos from the Sol system. What they learned in that final meeting broke the last of human certainty. The readings from the Golden Throne showed no power fluctuation, no mechanical failure. The Astronomicon was perfectly functional. It was reality that had changed. The psychic field the Emperor projected could no longer propagate because there was no longer a medium for it to travel through. The warp was dying, and with it, so too was everything that depended on thought, emotion, and memory. Everything that was alive. Across 1,000 worlds, people began to lose the ability to dream. Sleep became a hollow, empty state. Art, music, and prayer lost their meaning. Even rage and sorrow began to fade. What replaced them was not peace, but indifference, a numb stillness that spread faster than any plague. On hive worlds, riots broke out and then abruptly stopped, as if every mind had simultaneously lost interest in existence. On shrine worlds, worshippers wept, not because their gods had forsaken them, but because they could no longer remember why they had worshipped at all. In the Eye of Terror, the Chaos Gods fought against dissolution. Khorne's rage ignited for one final time, hurling worlds into burning ruin. But his power collapsed inward, feeding on itself, until only a single drop of motionless blood remained. Nurgle's laughter turned to a rattling cough as decay itself ceased. His garden fell silent, the last leaf crumbling to ash before vanishing into nothing. Tzeentch's crystal towers froze mid-shift, locking his infinite plots in perfect stillness. Slaanesh screamed as all sensation vanished, and with it, the very concept of pleasure. The warp's final collapse was not destruction, but awakening, the kind of quiet that exists before a thought forms. The dreams of gods, mortals, and demons all merged into a single, universal awareness. For a moment, every being in the galaxy shared the same realization. They were not separate. They had never been. They were patterns, temporary arrangements of consciousness within a greater sleeping mind. In the halls of the Black Library, the Harlequins gathered around the crumbling infinity mirrors. Sigurach, the laughing god, spoke his last words to the remaining seers of the Eldar. The punchline, he said softly, was never ours to tell. And with a final grin that flickered like a dying flame, he vanished. The infinity mirrors shattered, scattering motes of light into the dark fragments of dream returning to the dreamer. The Necrons, impervious to the warp, but not to the structure of reality itself, faced something they had no defense against: the breakdown of causality. Their weapons no longer fired in straight lines. Their tomb worlds began to flicker between existence and non-existence, as if their history were being rewritten in real time. The Silent King, watching his empire fade like smoke, finally understood what his equations had hinted at. The universe had always been a simulation of a deeper chaos, and the machine logic he worshipped was nothing more than a repeating dream. His final transmission to all remaining Necron dynasties contained a single message: we were never awake. And then there was the Emperor, entombed upon the golden throne. His body decayed, but his mind expanded beyond anything that had existed before. As the warp fell silent, his consciousness bridged the dying Imperium and the awakening void beyond it. For 10,000 years, he had been humanity's god, the light in the dark, the savior of men. Now he stood at the threshold of something so vast that even he could not define it. In that moment, he saw the truth. He was not the master of mankind. He was merely a reflection, the echo of the dreamer's attempt to imagine order within chaos. His war against the warp had been nothing more than the mind's futile struggle against itself. As he gazed into the blind throne, he saw countless realities, universes nested within universes, each one dreaming the next. And at the center of them all was the same sleeping presence, vast and mindless, eternally turning in its slumber. The Emperor spoke, not with words, but with thought, reaching into the emptiness. If you wake, he said, we end. And in the darkness, something answered, not in language, but in movement. The dreamer shifted, and the stars themselves trembled. Entire galaxies flickered, dissolving into dust and reforming as new patterns of light. Time folded upon itself, looping, unraveling, beginning again. The universe was no longer stable. It was rewriting itself according to the whim of the half-awake mind that contained it. Yet, within the chaos, something persisted, a memory, faint but stubborn, of humanity's endless struggle, its defiance, its will to exist even in futility. The Emperor clung to that fragment, holding it against the tidal pull of oblivion. If the universe was a dream, then humanity was its conscience. And as long as that conscience remembered itself, there was still something to resist the endless sleep. On every world, in every dying mind, a single phrase echoed, carried not by the warp, but by the residue of memory itself. We are the dream that refuses to end. And as the final light of the Astronomicon faded, leaving the galaxy in absolute darkness, the dreamer stirred once more. Its blind gaze turned inward, and within that gaze, a new spark flickered, a question, a possibility, a new dream waiting to begin. When the Emperor's final warning rippled through the Astronomicon, do not awaken the dreamer, many across the Imperium mistook it for metaphor. But on Mars, deep within the red planet's crust, a Mechanicus data crypt received something more tangible, an echo. The signal was not transmitted through the warp, nor through any known quantum spectrum. It simply appeared inside machine cognition itself, an idea inserted like a seed. The tech priests called it the reverberation. The signal spread like infection. Servitors across the red planet began murmuring fragments of binary prayers that no one had taught them. The words, when translated, formed one chilling sentence: the sleeper dreams beneath all gods. Soon, the same phrase appeared among the choir psychers of Terra, the chanting of the ecclesiarchy, even in the songs of feral children on distant hive worlds. The Imperium didn't recognize it as language, it was contagion, masquerading as prophecy. Meanwhile, within the warp, something shifted. Demons began to fracture mid-manifestation. Khorne's bloodthirsters froze mid-charge, their forms collapsing into ribbons of static. The Lords of Chaos, eternal and omnipotent, screamed not in rage but in fear. For the first time since the birth of time, their forms flickered, dissentious patterns inverted into chaos that even he could not predict. Slaanesh's decadent palaces turned silent, the music ceasing as if time itself skipped a beat. Nurgle's garden withered, its rot suddenly sterile. What terrified them was not destruction, but negation. They felt the approaching silence of something that unmade meaning itself. A being for whom thought was as alien as mortality is to the stars. And in the farthest regions of the Eye of Terror, warp storms began to flatten. The impossible geometries of the Imperium, the tides of emotion, the rivers of sin and faithal began to calm, as though something beneath existence itself was drawing in a breath. Eldar Farseers saw the same stillness through the infinity circuit. They called it the long pause. The tyrannid hive mind, across millions of light years, suddenly halted its synaptic pulse, as though listening. Even the Necron's command protocols detected fluctuations in the quantum fabric they had once conquered. Every sentient species felt it, the sense that reality had become aware of being watched. Then came the dreams. Not the kind born of sleep, but the kind that precede waking. Across the Imperium, psychers began to scream themselves blind. Their last recorded visions were of colossal tendrils coiling through space-not flesh, not energy, but a pattern of anti-thought. Planets trembled as warp space briefly inverted into a mirror of void black calm. The Inquisition's Ordo Chronos reported impossible time loops within their archives, events replaying, data rewriting itself. Individuals dying and reappearing days earlier, with knowledge of their own deaths. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica declared a state of warp emergency, but by then, communication across the galaxy had already broken down. And then, in silence deeper than death, the Astronomicon blinked out. The Emperor's light, the one constant across 10,000 years, vanished, not flared, not dimmed, simply ceased, as if someone had closed an eye. For 7 seconds, the Imperium ceased to exist in any meaningful way. Warp travel became impossible. Reality folded in upon itself, and then, faintly, through the blackness, came a single phrase from the mouth of every psyker still alive. The dreamer stirs on Terra. Deep within the golden throne, the Emperor's skeletal frame convulsed. Tech priests monitoring his life support systems saw something horrifying. The Astronomicon's signal had reversed polarity. It was no longer projecting light, it was receiving something. A broadcast from outside all known physics, a voice older than creation. For the first time in 10 millennia, the Emperor's eyes opened. No one could record what he saw, but every astropath within the Sol system dropped dead in unison, their souls erased rather than consumed. And yet, in that annihilating moment, the Master of Mankind whispered one final message into the warp. Not words, but emotion terror beyond description. Because what the Emperor realized, in that instant of lucidity, was that humanity's faith, chaos's hunger, And even the Imperium itself were not the dream, they were the dreamers. All of existence, from the Big Bang to the final war of the 41st millennium, was nothing more than the flickering thought of a blind god turning in its sleep. And now it was beginning to wake. There is no word in any human language for the silence that came next. When the Astronomicon died, it was not darkness that fell, but absence of void so complete that even the warp itself recoiled. The stars seemed frozen, their light trapped in a cosmos that no longer remembered how to move. Across Terra, the Adeptus Custodes stood motionless before the golden throne, their minds flooded by echoes of a soundless screams, something vast and ancient, uncoiling within every atom of reality. The Emperor's eyes, burning like dying suns, stared beyond the veil of the warp. For the first time since the birth of humanity, he saw the truth unfiltered. The Chaos Gods, those mighty reflections of mortal emotion, were not merely fading. They were being unwritten. Khorne's endless battlefields crumbled into dust that could no longer remember rage. Tessinch's labyrinths of fate collapsed into featureless plains of unpossibility. Nurgle's garden curdled into stillness, its rot denied the mercy of decay. Slaanish's symphonies stopped mid-note, every echo turning to ash. They screamed, not as gods, but as dreams dissolving. For eons they had believed themselves eternal, shaping mortals through corruption and faith. Yet now, as the great stillness deepened, they realized their true nature. They were thoughts within a sleeping mind, and that mind, the one they had never dared to name, was stirring. Deep within the fabric of the universe, the warp's colors bled away, leaving only a shimmering horizon, the boundary between existence and the unmade. The Emperor felt it pressing against his soul, the presence of the blind dreamer, the one whose slumber had spun the Imperium like foam atop an infinite sea. It was neither malevolent nor benevolent. It did not choose, it simply was. And as its consciousness began to move, the laws of physics shuddered. Planets shifted in their orbits. Black holes ceased to feed. Time fractured into shards of frozen moments. In the void between galaxies, reality thinned, revealing the faintest glimpse of something that should never be seen, a swirling, formless mass of colorless light, pulsing to a rhythm older than creation. The Emperor understood then that the Imperium, chaos, and even the warp were nothing more than reflections in a single, colossal-minded dream, within which every soul was a flicker of thought. He remembered the words from ancient Mechanicus inscriptions, the whispers from the Eldar oracles, the warnings of the Necrontyr before their fall. The universe endures only while the dream persists. If the dreamer fully awoke, all would end not with fire, but with understanding. Every war, every prayer, every act of love or hate would vanish into the calm of awareness. The Emperor realized his purpose had never been to rule mankind or defeat chaos. It had been to keep the dreamer asleep. The psychic beacon of the Astronomicon, the faith of billions, even the wars that fueled Desperal were mechanisms of distraction, keeping the dreamer lost within its own creation. But now, the balance had broken. Through the warp, the Emperor reached for the last fragments of the gods, gathering their dissolving essence into himself. He drew upon Khorne's fury, Tsench's knowledge, Nurgle's endurance, Slaanish's sensation, and bound them within his own spirit. He became a singularity of thought, the last self-aware consciousness within a collapsing dream. And as the dreamer's gaze turned toward him, the Emperor spoke into the void. Sleep. The word was not sound, it was will. It carried the weight of 10,000 years of human faith, of every soldier's death cry, every mother's prayer, every whisper of devotion ever uttered in the galaxy. The warp convulsed. The stars flickered once more. For an instant that stretched beyond time, the universe hesitated between waking and oblivion. Then, slowly, the pulse of existence resumed. The Astronomicon reignited, weaker, fainter, but alive. The Chaos Gods did not return as they once were. They became faint shadows, echoes without dominion. The dreamer turned once more in its slumber, the great eye of unbeing drifting shut. The Emperor fell silent upon the golden throne. His body was broken, but his mind had reached beyond eternity and returned. The Imperium, unaware of the cosmic precipice it had teetered upon, resumed its endless wars. The Inquisition sealed every record of the event. The Mechanicus purged all mention of the reverberation. The Eldar burned their runes and prayed never to hear the loom stir again. Only one message remained within the data stream of the Astronomicon, faint signal repeating across the stars in binary code. We are the dream that dreams itself, and somewhere in the infinite silence beyond the warp, a slow cosmic heartbeat continued. The blind dreamer slept once more, but not peacefully. Because sometimes, even in dreams, the dreamer remembers.